Hello, my name is Brady, and I'm the main character in Marshall E. Patterson's contemporary Christian fiction book, Life's Journey, Our Greatest Test. This is my story, a journey of self-destruction, despair, and ultimately, self-discovery. But I'm not the only one whose life is transformed. You'll witness how faith, resilience, and God's purpose unfold in the lives of those around me, proving that no one is beyond redemption. As a special gift, when you subscribe to Marshall E's mailing list, you'll receive the full PDF version of this free audio series. But that's not all. You'll also get a battle plan template to help you conquer Satan's lies in your daily life. Just check the link in the description. A new chapter will be uploaded every Thursday, so be sure to subscribe and stay connected. And if this story speaks to you, leave a comment and share this audio series with others who would be blessed by it. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. Freedom.
Brady O'Connor stood outside the Lexington prison's entrance and stared at the fortress that influenced his life's perspective. His time inside also helped him turn away from the destructive path on which he was. To many who had heard of Lexington Prison, it brought chills to their spines, and for others, the very thought of going there kept them on the straight and narrow. A mere passerby walking alongside the walls of Lexington Prison would not get the impression of it being a terrible place. But like many things in life, where the outer appearance often deceives many, so did Lexington. The walls stood majestic and tall. They glowed with a radiant reddish-brown. On top of its perimeter walls was barbed wire, which infused security in passers-by, leaving the prisoners incapable of escaping and troubling society. Brady turned his back towards the prison's entrance and looked out onto the busy street, watching the vehicles as they passed one by one. He had no idea what he was to do with his life now. Throwing his duffel bag over his shoulder, he flagged down an approaching bus. The bus stopped a few paces from him at what seemed to be the designated stop, causing him to chase after it. Once he paid his fare, he strolled past the few passengers and sat at the back of the bus. He leant back against the seat and closed his eyes. Thoughts of his grandmother Ruth popped into his head. He smiled. Ruth had always believed a lot of good was inside the darkened shell of a man he had been. She would always encourage him and often use Bible verses to convey her messages of hope to show him that God, the Father, was never far from him, even in the darkness that had surrounded him. Brady loved her and always listened to her, even if he could not understand her faithful devotion to God, who he thought had failed him the day his brother John died. In Ruth's last letter, she had not informed him of her illness or that she was nearing death. Her words were only of encouragement and about the painting he created for her when he was 14. Brady, she wrote, God has indeed blessed you with a special gift, and looking at this painting, I can see the man whom he called you to be. Sometimes it seems I can feel his presence more when I'm looking at your painting. There is such a light in you that I don't ever want to see go out. And for that reason, I haven't stopped praying for God to deliver you from all your troubles. Take heart, my dear. The eyes of the Lord are always upon the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. Trust in him always. A few teardrops slipped from Brady's eyes. He averted his gaze to the window to escape the passengers' glares, who would often glance in his direction after seeing him get on at Lexington Prison. The journey to Ruth's house was exactly 25 hours after transferring to a Greyhound bus, with 3 bus transfers. His muscles ached, and the long drive made him anxious. Nonetheless, he smiled in appreciation for the scenic view, which relaxed his mind for most of the journey. He felt pleased about being one of the last passengers to disembark the bus that he turned to face the driver once he disembarked. Thank you, sir, for a pleasant drive. He smiled with a slight nod. Have a good night. The driver reciprocated by tipping his hat. You too, young man. He then closed the bus door and drove out of sight. Brady took a deep breath. The walk towards Ruth's house would take him off the main road and onto a little quiet track that snaked through the wooded area of Memphis, Tennessee's countryside. After walking for a couple of minutes, he pulled his hoodie over his head to protect his cheeks from the chill in the air. He stopped and smiled. Memories of when he and John used to run through the woods, playing hide and seek in the trees, and playing cowboy and Indians surfaced. Flickering lights from the neighboring houses switched his thoughts to that of the last letter he had received. Mrs. Walsh, his grandmother's best friend, and a next-door neighbor had informed him of Ruth's passing and of what she had left him. As he approached the front door to Mrs. Walsh's house, Brady wondered if her granddaughter Clara still lived there. Clara had been a friend of his and John's since they had visited their grandmother as kids. A sudden nervousness overcame him as he knocked on the door. He pondered what she would think of him, knowing he'd been locked up in Lexington prison for the past 7 years, knowing that only the most unpredictable of criminals ended up there. He felt the shame of it taking hold of him. He shook himself as to not entertain any negative thoughts. She might understand, like Graham, he thought, trying to reassure himself. A few minutes passed before the door opened, revealing a petite Asian woman. Wrinkles and a bright smile creased her face. "Brady!" Without warning, the old woman, who stood a little shorter than him, pulled him into a tight embrace. "How are you?" she asked softly after she released him. She stared up at him. Brady smiled back at her. "I'm okay, Mrs. Walsh." "Well then, good." She looped her arm through his. "Come, let's go inside, and I'll make you something to eat. I know you must be hungry after such a long journey." "I certainly am." He chuckled and walked with her into the house. Upon entering the living room, Mrs. Walsh pointed to the couch and said, "Have a seat, Brady. Be back in a few minutes." With short, quick steps, Mrs. Walsh darted across the room and disappeared into the kitchen. Brady let out a long breath and removed his duffel bag from his shoulders. He dropped it on the couch, sank next to it, and leant back. Closing his eyes, he smiled and thought of pleasant times he had spent in this house with Clara and John. "Here you go," Mrs. Walsh said a few minutes later, breaking his trip down memory lane. She placed a tray on the coffee table in front of him. Brady opened his eyes and smiled. "Thank you." "You're welcome, my dear." Mrs. Walsh pulled up her favorite chair next to the couch and sat down. She smiled, watching Brady, as he closed his eyes and said a quick prayer over his food. "There's more if you want," she added when he opened his eyes and reached for the chicken sandwich. Brady nodded. By the time he finished swallowing the last of the chicken sandwich, he had turned to look at Mrs. Walsh for the first time since he started eating. "That tasted so good, Mrs. Walsh." "Thank you." He reached for the cup of hot chocolate, closed his eyes, and savored the taste while he sipped. "I needed this." Mrs. Walsh chuckled. "Oh, before I forget, Brady, let me get that envelope your grandmother left for you." She leapt to her feet and scurried from the room. Brady picked up the tray containing the cup and dish and sauntered into the kitchen. He placed them in the sink and proceeded to wash them. A radiant smile covered his face as more memories of himself, John, and Clara flooded his mind. He thought about them running in and out of this very kitchen to sample Mrs. Walsh's baked goods that comprised great cakes and pies. It was an old-fashioned house. Lots of green shrubberies ran along its walls, as was the case in most houses in the area. Like all the people in this wooded region, Mrs. Walsh kept most of her windows closed throughout the daytime to keep lizards and other small creatures out of the house. The kitchen area was spacious and never put Brady, Clara, or John at any risk of getting hurt while Mrs. Walsh baked. The backyard, however, was small, but this did not put a damper on them having fun, since they utilized the woods and the river most. "Oh, Brady, you didn't need to wash those. You're my guest," Mrs. Walsh said, startling him as she entered the kitchen and saw him placing the plate in the dish drainer. Brady dried his hands on the dish towel that hung in front of the sink. Then he turned around as she approached him and leant back against the sink. "Mrs. Walsh, you're not a stranger to me, although it's been a while since I last saw you. But I'd feel awful just eating your food and not helping you at least clean up. You're not so young anymore either," he teased with a smirk on his face. She chuckled at his remark and stretched the envelope to him. "Here you go." Brady reached for the envelope and stared at it, almost as if he was afraid to open it. "It's the deed to the house, the keys, and a bank book with your name in it. Ruth loved you very much, Brady. She left her life savings in that account. It's not millions, but enough to help you start something new with your life. Sometimes she and I would sit out on the porch, and she would ask me to pray with her for you. One thing she always asked God for was to bring you to the light that he brought out of you through your paintings when you were a boy," Mrs. Walsh informed him with a gentle pat on the shoulder. "Oh, hold on, Brady." Mrs. Walsh took a closer step to the sink and pulled open one of its drawers. After shuffling through all its contents, She pulled out a flashlight and tested to see if it worked. Feeling satisfied, she shoved the drawer closed, then stretched the flashlight to Brady. "What's this for?" he questioned her, confused. "You'll need it on your way over. Ruth had asked me to disconnect all the utilities after she died. She did not want the money she left you to be eaten up by bills, since no one would be living there other than yourself. You'll need to go into town to get them reconnected." "Oh, okay, thanks." He took the flashlight from her hands and stepped away from the sink. "I better be heading over now, too." "All right, let me walk you to the door." Mrs. Walsh stepped ahead of him and led the way. Upon entering the living room, Brady stopped by the couch, tucked the flashlight under his arm, and reached for his duffel bag. "Hold on, Mrs. Walsh," he called after her when she almost made it to the door to the hallway. She spun around a bit fast, thinking something was wrong, and then chuckled to herself when she saw Brady loosening the drawstring of his bag and thrusting the envelope inside. When he closed the bag and proceeded to put it on his back, she spoke. "Brady, I want you to have dinner with me in the evenings. I don't want you to be too alone all day, and I could use the company myself too." She smiled. "I would like that, Mrs. Walsh." He took a few quick strides towards her. When he neared her, he kissed her cheek and smiled. "Thank you for always being so kind." A big smile spread across her face. "You've made an old woman happy." She looped her arm through his as they proceeded to the front door. "Has much changed in town since I last visited?" Brady asked while Mrs. Walsh pulled back the locks on the door. "Not so much, just a few new businesses." Mrs. Walsh pushed the door open, then turned to Brady. "I'm glad you're home. Thank you so much, Mrs. Walsh, for everything you gave me tonight. I needed it. For so many years, I felt lost, even for myself, but Graham kept seeing a light in me that I could not recognize. I can't change all the terrible things I did, but I've asked God every day to help me get past the nightmare of it all and to help me walk in His light. I also want to make Graham proud. Don't feel too bad. We all do terrible things in life that we later regret, some more than others, but that does not mean the one who does less is loved any more than the one who does a lot in the eyes of God, our Father. To Him, we all need His love equally. Sometimes, even the sin that does not seem to do much damage on the surface is causing far worse beneath. You're only 29, Brady. Embrace your second chance." He smiled and nodded in agreement. Just as he stepped outside, he turned to face her. "Mrs. Walsh, I had wanted to ask you from the minute you opened your door about Clara, but when you hugged me, everything slipped my mind. Where is she now? And how is she doing?" "Ah, my dear, she went off to join her parents in Canada 8 years ago. She's a nurse now." Mrs. Walsh smiled and then continued. "She almost got married 2 years ago, but called it off without any explanation to anyone." Her brows furrowed in perplexity. "Whatever happened? Only she and her ex-fiancé know. Does she know about me?" he asked nervously. "Yes, she does. And don't worry, she doesn't hate you. Although, she hated how you let your life go down that destructive pathway. Thanks again, Mrs. Walsh. Good night." "Good night, Brady. Remember to stop by tomorrow for dinner." "I will." As Brady walked off into the dark, his mind wandered to Clara again. Oh, Clara, what kind of secret are you keeping from everyone? That's it for today's chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for the next episode, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss it. If this story speaks to you, share your thoughts in the comments. Marshall would love to hear from you. See you in the next chapter.